hold on, just getting a little recording memo. I live in regional Victoria, but I work between Melbourne and regional Victoria. And, you know, I own a yoga studio in regional Victoria. So I do definitely, and we're not open yet. So yeah, it's a weird old time to be in Victoria, but still really nice to connect with people. And I think, you know, share some knowledge, you know, some takeaways that are going to help us get through the lockdown period. You know, some of us might actually really love lockdown. You know, I speak to sort of over 20 clients a week, and like often the response on the other end of the line is like, I'm fine. You know, I'm loving working from home, and I love having my kids around and my family around. And for other people, lockdown is really challenging. And some of that challenging element of lockdown manifests to going back to, you know, old sort of comfy behaviors of making the toasty for lunchtime and having a little more chocolate than you would usually have, and going back and forth to the kitchen when you've got a spare minute sort of between meetings a little more often than you would usually. So hopefully this conversation is a way in which I can, you know, share and help and give back, you know, with the knowledge and expertise that I have at a time where I think, you know, many of us are challenged in different ways and adjusting to different ways of doing things again in Victoria. So this seminar is titled Food Myths, Real Food and Transforming Your Metabolism. I think what I really love dialing in on is food myths. And some of you will find what I talk about, perhaps something that sort of goes against the grain of what you've learned about food. You know, some of your, I guess, age-old concepts around food and healthy eating, and I don't mind that. I think it's never too late to learn new things, and you're here for a reason, which suggests to me that you're interested in learning about food, perhaps from a different angle than you've learned before. I'm also really big on sharing practical tips and advice. So, you know, I might highlight little areas where you can get a pen or get your notes out on your phone and jot down some little things, because, you know, like Mark said, razor edge habits. I think it's, you know, from my perspective, I would love to know that in leaving this session, you personally have, you know, 2 or 3 things that you want to go and do differently. And I might talk, you know, a little bit around those practical behaviors. And I don't expect you to remember everything that I tell you tonight, but hopefully if there is just 1 or 2 things that you can pick up and go away and do slightly differently, that would be a wonderful thing. And then maybe you can go and tell the rest of the people in your household these things, and then we can start to, you know, spread the knowledge about healthy behaviors and healthy eating, especially when we're stressed and challenged. So transforming your metabolism. You know, metabolism is a word that most people have heard, but they don't really know what it means. You know, most people have heard that in order to, you know, lose weight or to burn body fat, you need to, quote unquote, speed up your metabolism. You know, I've definitely heard that. And I've definitely heard people say to me, you know, oh, I've got a slow metabolism, but my partner has a fast metabolism. And they're the sort of like words that are used around metabolism. And then we've probably also heard that in order to speed up your metabolism, we need to be eating more frequently. So we need to be doing the sort of eating every 2 to 3 hours. And so the myths that I'm going to be busting in this session really are around, you know, what it takes to, first of all, develop an efficient metabolism, not necessarily a fast metabolism, but an efficient one. And what it takes to help your body burn fat and utilize fat, which, you know, just to sort of let the cat out of the bag early, it doesn't involve, you know, speeding up your metabolism, so to speak. It involves developing an efficient metabolism. And metabolic health is really fundamental to long-term health and longevity, right? So I think the way we've used the term metabolism has led people, I guess, to associate it with just like a body composition, like a shape or size type thing. Like, yeah, I've got a fast metabolism, so I find it hard to gain weight, or I've got a slow metabolism, so I find it really easy to gain weight. But metabolism affects many bodily functions. It affects energy, it affects digestion, it can affect our mood. So metabolism is something that's really fundamental to us having like quality life and a long life as well. So this conversation is not just relevant to those of you that are like, oh, I'm worried about lockdown and, potentially, gaining some body fat, but this conversation is actually really important to those of you that are thinking like, we're not all invincible, and I do have to take care of my health, and I do have that within my power. I think that's, the sort of mindset that we need to approach the word metabolism from. Yeah. Because I don't know, not many of you have got your cameras on, but please put your hand up if you resonate with me that we've traditionally talked about metabolism as being a body composition type thing, as opposed to being, a actual sort of global health concept. So good, thank you, show of hands. So the first myth that I wanted to bust around metabolic health is that in order to achieve metabolic health, we need to be following the food pyramid. So one of the key risk factors for metabolic disease, which is basically a cluster of symptoms, one of the key symptoms or factors associated with metabolic disease is dyslipidemia. So elevated cholesterol, low LDL level, so high LDL levels, low HDL levels, so dyslipidemia. And a lot of physicians or a lot of individuals who perhaps, I want to say, come from like an older school mentality, perhaps haven't been to university in more recent years or haven't started to look at the more recent research around health, would still prescribe to a food pyramid model of nutrition. Yeah, so this food pyramid model of nutrition, where obviously there's been some great evolutions over the years, but this food pyramid, this healthy eating plate that we're still subscribed to here in Australia and most Western countries, is a healthy eating plate that still very much sits on a foundation of cereal and grain-based foods. So most nutritionists, most physicians would not disagree on the need for lots of fresh fruit and vegetables to be there on our healthy eating plate, our healthy eating guidelines. But where there's a lot of controversy now in the health and wellness space is this heavy foundation, this heavy prescription for cereal and grain-based foods in our healthy eating guidelines. Yeah. So some of you might remember the pyramid that sat on like the back of our cereal packets. Some of you may be more familiar with the healthy eating plate that is now sort of delivered in schools. And like I said, there's been iterations over the last few decades, but there's still a heavy prescription for cereal and grain-based foods in these healthy eating guidelines. And if you delve into the detail, you'll see that we're actually being told to eat 6 to 11 serves of these cereal and grain-based foods per day. Now, one serve being the equivalent to a couple of pieces of bread, for example. So first and foremostly, one of my biggest concerns around a prescription for 6 to 11 serves is that if we're setting that as the foundation of our healthy eating principles, I don't know how there would be room for the 6 cups of like leafy greens and vegetables that should be in our diet, and the fruit on top of that, and then the room for the protein and the healthy fats. So one of my concerns, not just a personal concern, but this is a broader concern, is that, that heavy prescription for cereal and grain-based foods is displacing room on the plate for a lot of the nutrient-dense, antioxidant-rich foods that should actually be part of our diet and will actually help to, prevent the onset of metabolic disease risk factors like dyslipidemia. If you were to get into the calorie counting side of things, get an app like MyFitnessPal, which I'm not saying you all need to go and do, but if you were to do that and you were to put those 6 to 11 serves of cereal and grain-based foods in there, you would see that it's the equivalent to around about 400 to 600 grams of carbohydrates per day. Now, I don't expect all of you to have a great level of relativity when it comes to understanding like what 400 to 600 grams of carbohydrates is. You probably haven't, all got into that calorie counting mindset before, and I don't expect you to. But I do expect you to have an understanding of what it feels like to have pushed the limits on your carbohydrate intake, because we do all have a limit. And so some of the signs of pushing your limits on carbohydrate intake are the signs of an inefficient metabolism. So that's, the person that wants to eat every couple of hours. It's the person that has cravings for really carbohydrate rich foods or really sweet foods, especially straight after a meal. Yeah, so if you've got a craving for a big bowl of pasta and then after that pasta you want some sweets, some dessert. It's the person who gets to mid-afternoon and they're experiencing the hangries. So the hangries, some of you may have heard me define the hangries in our last seminar, but the hangries is essentially a situation whereby we've got such an inefficient metabolism, such poor blood sugar control, that when we get hungry, we get angry, and we put the two words together and we get hangry. The hangries, like I said, often associates mid-afternoon, like 3:30, which is, I think, also a reflection of being on the blood sugar roller coaster, which again is a sign of an inefficient metabolism. So the blood sugar roller coaster, I want to describe it because this is where a lot of people are like, oh yeah, okay, I do have a less than optimal metabolism. So the blood sugar roller coaster is essentially when your energy levels are really reflected by what you can eat. Yeah, so the average Aussie will eat breakfast in the morning, and like a typical sort of healthy breakfast option would be a couple of pieces of toast with like some jam or some peanut butter or some Vegemite, or it might be a bowl of Wheat Bix with some yogurt and honey, or it might be a smoothie with some banana oats, honey and milk. And those would be considered like sort of healthy Aussie breakfast options, but they're all high in carbohydrate. And so what that does is cause this big rise in blood glucose levels, which causes an equal and opposite drop in blood glucose levels, which is usually what coincides with an individual wanting to eat in about the 2 to 3 hours after their breakfast. Okay, so then the blood sugar goes up again and then it comes down again, and then lunch falls 2 or 3 hours later, so it comes up again and goes down again, and then 3:30 hits. And we've been on this blood sugar roller coaster all day long. We've been exercising all of this self-control, that by 3:30, that's when we're like, oh my God, get me some cake or some chocolate or some bickies or some coffee or all of those things to help pick me back up and get me through the afternoon. So if that blood sugar roller coaster is something that resonates with you, if the hangries is something that you experience, if the cravings for carb-rich foods or sugary foods are things that you resonate with, then they're signs of an inefficient metabolism. So not necessarily a slow metabolism, but an inefficient metabolism. And I will talk a little bit more about what an efficient metabolism actually looks like. But first of all, I want to talk about how we get there. So rather than using the food pyramid to help sort of dictate our metabolism, let's look at, like, I think what should be taught in schools, which is to just eat real food. So some of you who follow us at The Natural Nutritionist may be familiar with this acronym. I don't know, some of you may have already been sharing it around with one another, but Just Eat Real Food is the acronym that we live by at The Natural Nutritionist. And that stands for, JERF stands for Just Eat Real Food. And eating real food, like, it sounds super simple, but I think the fact that we do have such increasing rates of overweight and obesity and type 2 diabetes and other metabolic conditions suggests that we actually have started to lose sight of what real food is. And I think, we run the risk of, like, the generations to come getting even further away from real food, because packaged food is just, it's where it's at. Kids these days, unless the school makes a real effort, kids don't even know what broccoli looks like coming out of the ground or what spinach looks like coming out of the ground. And so Just Eat Real Food, one of the first and guiding principles of real food is to always eat food that looks the way it did when it came out of the ground, off the tree, or from the animal. And I think it's really important for people to be connected with what food looks like in these ways, right? Like, the more we become reliant on packaged cereal and packaged bars and you know, pre-prepared stuff, the further away we get from understanding what food looked like in its whole and real state. Yeah. So you've got to start remembering that, like, you know, the secret to your longevity is to just eat real food. Try and look for food that is as close to the way it was when it came out of the ground, off the tree, or from the animal. I know I repeated that, but I think it makes things really simple. And if there's like a little just quote that rings in your mind after tonight's session, it's that, you know, on what real food is. Real food is food that is void of some of the biggest contributors to inflammation, and inflammation being the underlying cause of many of today's biggest killers. You know, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, metabolic disease, and in there I put type 2 diabetes, inflammation being a contributor to autoimmune conditions, which are, you know, not on the list of the biggest killers today, but certainly growing in terms of their prevalence. So foods that will contribute to inflammation, number one, trans fatty acids. These are only found in processed and packaged foods. They're used in frozen goods to help extend their shelf life. So trans fatty acids, essentially chemically altered vegetable oils to help improve the shelf life of food. So things like pizza bases that are frozen, pastries that are frozen, anything else like baked goods that are frozen, often trans fatty acids will be in there. They will slowly become less and less part of the food system, but unfortunately they are still there, and they're incredibly inflammatory. They contribute to elevating triglyceride levels and reducing HDL cholesterol levels, and we don't want them in our diet. The other thing that's incredibly inflammatory, which is controversial, and I did go into this in our last seminar on Digestive Health 101, but the other inflammatory ingredient is gluten. Gluten is a wheat protein found in wheat, rye, barley, couscous, semolina, spelt. It's a long list. It is a protein which, for a subset of the population who have celiac disease, is, you know, categorically one that can't be in the diet. It's an autoimmune condition, which means they can't tolerate gluten. But for the rest of us, gluten can contribute to hyperpermeability in the gut lining or increased intestinal permeability, which then can open up the floodgates for inflammation to take place. If anyone wants to learn more about that, because we just won't have time to go into that into detail in this session, you could probably go and type gluten into the search panel on our website, which is thenaturalnutritionist.com.au, or Chris Kresser, that's Kresser with a K, Resser, also has some good reading and writing on gluten and hyperpermeability. And probably the godfather of research on gluten and hyperpermeability is a researcher by the name of Alessio Fasano. I think it's Fersano, if you're interested in doing any extra reading on that. But the other incredibly inflammatory food that we want to avoid in the diet is processed carbohydrates. Processed carbohydrates is essentially like the food industry taking what is a cheap product and then like morphing it and adding things to it and extending the shelf life and bulking it out and making it more palatable and helping people to want to eat more of the stuff, so that they in turn can sell more of their products. That's the way I see processed carbohydrates. I sort of think of it like the property industry taking blocks of land and knocking down one beautiful big house and then putting, you know, 5 units on there because it becomes a more profitable piece of land. Sort of like that's what happens when the food industry takes some wheat and then morphs it and turns it into something else they can add a higher price to. And unfortunately, you know, we might be the ones that enjoy the food, but it doesn't do anything for our health to be including those processed carbohydrates. So that includes like the confectionery stuff, which I think we would all associate as being not so good and highly processed. So, you know, our lollies and, you know, our cakes and our pastries. But it also includes some of the stuff that we would categorize as being good. You know, pasta is still a processed carbohydrate, bread is still a processed carbohydrate, and you know, breakfast cereals are still processed carbohydrates, and you know, these have the ability to put us on that blood sugar roller coaster. So they're like my guiding principles around eating real food, which is, like I said, you know, to focus on food that looks the way it did when it came out of the ground, off the tree, or from the animal. And secondly, to try and avoid the foods that will have the biggest influence on inflammation within our body. You know, obviously there are other things that can contribute to inflammation, like, you know, external chemicals and environment. But as a nutritionist, my goal is to make sure that the things you put in your mouth aren't going to contribute to inflammation. So remember, trans fatty acids, gluten, and processed carbohydrates are up there on the list. So that's the guiding principles around just eating real food. But what are you looking for at meal times? And this is where I sort of want you to get your pen out and make some notes, because your judgment, you know, could be a little bit clouded, depending on how emotionally affected you are by lockdown, you know, whether it's like stress or fatigue from having to juggle family and work, you know, in a way that you wouldn't usually have to. So yeah, when your judgment is clouded, I want you to come back to this little virtual checklist that I'm going to talk you through. So the first thing on your virtual checklist at meal times is non-starchy vegetables. You know, non-starchy vegetables being basically any vegetable other than potato, sweet potato, beetroot, and parsnip. The rest is like free game. So, you know, spinach, carrot, Brussels sprouts, carrots, capsicum, onion, garlic, mushrooms, fennel. I won't keep going because you get the gist. But, you know, the more of these that you can have in your shopping trolley, virtual or in real life, the more of these you can be purchasing each week, the better, right? Because diversity is key. You want to eat the rainbow. I tend to encourage my clients, if they're looking for 2 cups of non-starchy vegetables per main meal, which is the goal, that one of those is green and one of them is colored. And with that, you get, you know, you get the rainbow, but you get this big, you also have this focus on deep greens at meal times. So 2 cups of non-starchy veg. The second thing you're looking for on your virtual checklist at meal times is quality protein. Protein size is going to vary depending on the individual and their goal, but generally speaking, let's split it out to male and female. So men, you're going to be looking for 3 to 4 eggs as a portion of protein. You'll be looking at around about 150 grams of raw animal protein, like red meat, fish or chicken, 150 grams of tofu or tempeh if you want those plant-based options, or a cup of legumes if you want another plant-based option. And for women, slightly smaller, yeah, so 2 to 3 eggs, 120 grams of red meat, white meat or fish, 120 grams of tofu or tempeh, and a smaller serve of lentil and legumes if you want those as an option at meal times. The third item on your virtual checklist are the healthy fats. And the healthy fats is, like, I could have a whole other discussion on healthy fats, and I will talk about it a bit over the course of this session. But healthy fats, I think that we've forgotten about the physiological role that fats play within our body. You know, I went to university in the noughties, I grew up in the 90s, and you know, fat was demonized. We thought that eating fat would make us fat. We knew that fat had more calories per gram. And in a calorie counting model of health and fat loss, fat was therefore demonized. Okay. But I want you to remember that fat serves a physiological purpose. We have vitamins that we can't hold and absorb unless we eat fats. Fats basically protect our cells. There's like this lipid membrane that sits around our cells. Fat forms part of our brain. Fat supports energy production. Fat supports hormone production. So like fats have a physiological role, and I want you to remember that. We can't just think of fats as being excess calories, okay? So the fats on your plate, of course, the amount that you have is going to vary depending on your goals, depending on your agenda. But by and large, you'll be looking for between 1 to 2 serves of fats per main meal. And I would say if you're a guy, start at the 2 serves per meal. If you're a female, start at the 1 serve per meal, and then let appetite control be your guide. So 1 serve of fats would be the equivalent of half an avocado, 2 tablespoons of nuts and seeds or their butters, 2 tablespoons of quality oils, and I classify those as being things like extra virgin olive oil, cold pressed avocado oil, organic coconut oil, macadamia nut oil is not a bad choice as well, and flaxseed oil if it's at room temperature or fridge temperature. Other fats include animal fat, so the fat which you might get from eggs, the fat you might get from lamb or beef, and fish as well, and then coconut products. Yes, coconut products. So yogurt, cream, milk, you can have those, and about 100 mils would be considered a serving of fat. The last thing on your virtual checklist, so remember we've been through non-starchy vegetables, quality proteins, fats, and the last thing on your virtual checklist is whole food carbohydrates. And I sort of want you to think about it in this order, because you should be filling up on the first 3 things and then adding the whole food carbohydrates according to how much room there is left, or according to your training schedule. So if you exercise, if you've been down to the beach and done a workout, if you've been for a jog, then you need to have carbohydrates with the meal that you eat after that training session. If you don't, you'll feel terrible and you'll probably blame me for it. So make sure you eat carbs after those training sessions in particular. The other meals of your day, use appetite as your guide again. But you want to fill up on your veggies, proteins, and quality fats, and then add the carbs when there's room. As opposed to what happened like when I was growing up, my dad would fill his bowl with rice, and we had like our big curry bowls, and he would fill the bowl with rice and then put a couple of spoons of curry on top of it. And it should be the opposite. So it should be a bowl full of curry with beautiful veggies in there, your protein, your coconut cream, and then the rice gets added to it, if you think that you can't fill up on veggies, chicken and coconut cream, for example. Okay. I think you get the gist, but like another example would be a toasted sandwich. Like in a toasted sandwich, those first 3 items, they've sort of fallen off the checklist. It's sort of like a lot of bread with maybe an accompaniment of cheese and ham, for example. But if you were to think about it the other way around, you'd realize I'm not getting 2 cups of non-starchy veg in my toasted sandwich. I'm not getting a full portion of protein. I'm not getting 2 serves of quality fats, but I am checking that final item of carbohydrates. So how can you make your toasted sandwich a little different so that you are actually following that checklist? So, that's where you might do like an open layered sandwich with like roast veggies and then your ham and then some avo and maybe some cheese there as well. But you've got 1 piece of bread on the bottom of that stack, that open sandwich. I don't know, I'm just talking off cuff here when it comes to building an open sandwich, but trying to highlight where the priority should be when you're building your meals. Okay. And I'm sure that you can apply a similar principle to what you had for dinner tonight, or we're going to have for dinner tonight, or what you've got planned for tomorrow. When we build meals in that way that I've just talked through, what we achieve is satiety. And this leads me on to my second myth around developing an efficient metabolism, which is that we've previously been told and perpetuated this myth, in the health and wellness industry. We've perpetuated it, that's for sure. Perpetuated this myth that we need to be eating every 2 to 3 hours to maintain our metabolism, create a quick metabolism, keep the fire stoked, so to speak. But what happens when we eat every couple of hours is that we're really sort of predisposing to a sugar burning metabolism as opposed to supporting this fat burning metabolism. So we've got 2 different fuel sources that we can tap into. We've got carbs or sugar, basically the same thing when it comes to the eyes of the body, or we've got fats. We have another macronutrient called protein, but it's not typically used to produce energy. So we've got carbs and fats to produce energy with. And an inefficient metabolism is one that can really only tap into the carbs to produce energy, right? That's the inefficient metabolism. The efficient metabolism is one that can burn predominantly fats but really easily switched into a sugar slash carbohydrate burning mode when it's needed the most. Okay. So that's when, like, we're working out at high intensity, or when we need to, you know, fight or run or do something like that that's going to help to save our lives. So that's what an efficient metabolism is. It's that flexibility that, you know, another term that we use is metabolic flexibility. So this ability to burn fats predominantly, but also burn carbohydrate. And what happens when you're eating every couple of hours, so when you're going to that sort of older school model, or that mentality of eating every 2 to 3 hours to, you know, keep the fire stoked, what happens when you're doing that is you're really predisposing the body towards a sugar burning state. Because when we eat, especially if we eat a meal that is really high in carbohydrates and proportionately low in protein and quality fats, what happens is we get this high blood sugar rise, which I mentioned before. And in response to that, our body releases this hormone called insulin. And insulin's job is to help the muscle cells take up sugar from the bloodstream, which it has to do, because if blood sugar remains too high, that then becomes very dangerous. So, you know, our body has these homeostatic mechanisms in place, and hormones are that. Like, hormones are basically the sensors which are helping to keep things in homeostasis. And insulin is the hormone that helps to keep blood sugar in homeostasis. So when insulin comes out to do its job of normalizing blood sugar levels, what insulin does is stops fat burning from taking place, because it's like, hey body, you've got all this sugar here, we can't store sugar exponentially, so you got to burn the sugar. We'll just put the fat where we can store it, and we'll put it to the side whilst we deal with this sugar that's coming to the system, right? So insulin in normal amounts is a very good thing, because it helps to normalize blood sugars and stops us from getting high blood sugars. Insulin in high amounts is a very detrimental thing, because it displaces and stops fat burning, and it also can become inflammatory and do a number of other things which start to impact, you know, other body systems. But in its simplest, like in this simple model that we're talking about tonight, think of insulin as being, you know, productive in small amounts for normalizing blood sugar levels, but counterproductive in higher amounts because it increases fat storage and inhibits fat burning. So in order to get this metabolic flexibility and create the environment where our body can tap into fat as a fuel source, what we want to do is reduce circulating insulin levels. And because insulin comes out in response to elevating blood glucose levels, we got to go like one step back, which is to limit the carbohydrates that we eat, or to think about them as being proportionate to the amount of fats and protein that we eat. And that's why I sort of went through that list in that order, because when there's adequate fats and protein and relatively small amounts of carbohydrate, it stabilizes the blood sugar rise, which means it then stabilizes the insulin surge. Hope that makes sense. I haven't really got like a graph that I'm showing you, but I'm getting a few nods. Okay. So if eating every 2 to 3 hours causes this rise in blood glucose every 2 to 3 hours, which causes this rise in insulin every 2 to 3 hours, which basically shuts off fat burning, then to create the efficient metabolism that can burn fat, what we want to do is eat like every 4 to 5 hours, or even leave it a little bit longer if you can. And when I tell my clients this, they're a little bit like intimidated, like, oh my God, you expect me to go from like 8 o'clock to 1 o'clock without eating? But when you build your meal in the way that I just described, you will naturally find that it's a lot easier to go the 4 to 5 hours between your main meals. So it shouldn't be this scenario of like looking at the clock and like, tapping your fingers and not being able to concentrate until your next meal. It should be this natural, like, I had breakfast at 8 and now it's 12 o'clock and I haven't thought about food, but I think I could eat and I could go and prepare my lunch in a fairly like rational manner because I'm not absolutely starving. That's what I'm talking about. Appetite control, and that's what you should notice comes about as a result of building your meals in the way that I just talked about. Sometimes it can take a little transition. So some people might find that in the first 4 to 7 days, they don't quite have those 4 to 5 hours of satiety, from their main meals. But usually by about the 2-week mark, that satiety is there and people really report like, okay, cool. I can get through my day with like my breakfast, my lunch, my dinner. And when you think about it like that, like, oh, I can get through my day with breakfast, lunch, dinner, and I'm not having to I'm not having to account for like the mid-morning snack, the afternoon snack, and the cravings for sugar that I have after dinner. Well, then the more calorie-rich fats at meal times suddenly make sense, right? Because what you're doing is you're getting on the front foot. You're adding these healthy fats, which may be higher in calories, but you're adding them to your main meals, which means you won't be looking for extra calories and things between your meals. So if you are somebody that comes from a calorie counting background and you are concerned about using sort of more calorie rich fats at main meals, that's the only reason I wanted to highlight that difference, because it's sometimes the question that I get posed by my clients that have, traditionally come from a calorie counting background. So I want to come around to the amount of carbohydrates that we should be adding, because I appreciate that I just sort of threw it out there that, we need to reduce carbs in order to stabilize our blood glucose levels and therefore moderate insulin levels. But it's not just a one size fits all carbohydrate allowance. I like to look at carbohydrate requirements as like being somewhere on a spectrum, and the low end of the spectrum being quite an extreme low carbohydrate diet, like the ketogenic diet. Some of you may have heard of that. It's certainly been doing the rounds over the last like 4 or 5 years. And the higher end of this spectrum being something like a 150 to 200 grams of carbohydrates. So that's the spectrum of carbohydrate intake. Remembering what I said earlier, the 6 to 11 serves of cereal and grain-based foods per day will see us eating around about 400 to 600 grams of carbohydrates. So this spectrum is certainly very different to, the relatively high carbohydrate healthy eating model that, currently is prescribed in Australia and the most of the West. This spectrum is a lot lower, but there's a lot of flexibility within the spectrum as well. Most people don't need to be down the extreme ketogenic end of the spectrum. I would say that's usually like when you're at intervention state, when you need to lose weight very quickly, to go into surgery, for example, or when you need to get very quick control of blood sugars because you're staring down the barrel of type 2 diabetes and your doctor's given you 3 months before you do or don't go on medication. So ketogenic would be quite an extreme situation, and most people doing that should work with somebody one-on-one. But most of you, if you're thinking about how to apply this like lower carbohydrate model, this build your plate model to your day, think about your carb requirements as probably being somewhere between 75 to 150 grams of carbohydrates per day. Generally speaking, the more healthy you are, the more active you are, you would be higher up that spectrum. So if you're somebody that's just wanting to gain some appetite control and, think about nutrient density, then I would say, around about the 150 grams of carbs per day, which would be adding some whole food carbs to most of your main meals. Whole food carbs being things like, fruit, potatoes, sweet potato, quinoa, and rice. If you're somebody that knows your cravings are sort of out of control and you are putting on some weight and you're definitely experiencing the hangries on, one or multiple days of the week or multiple times per day, then I would say bring in it a little bit and think about reducing your carbohydrates to between like 75 to 100 grams of carbs per day, which would see you limiting those whole food carbs to 1, maybe 2 serves per day, and always having them post exercise, especially if the exercise involves lifting, pushing, pulling, jumping, doing anything with a level of intensity. Okay, so that's our carbohydrate spectrum. I wouldn't recommend diving in at the extreme end, but I would recommend thinking about, what your goals are and whether you're at the sort of 1, maybe 2 serves of carbs per day, or if you're at the like 2, maybe 3 serves of carbs per day. The other thing that can influence our insulin levels, so, if I was just talking about the influence of carbohydrates on our insulin levels and our fat burning ability. The other thing that can influence our insulin levels is cortisol. Okay. So this is where like me, the nutritionist, has to turn a little bit into like me, the like life coach and deep breathing coach. Even though they're not my areas of expertise, I do talk about them day in, day out, because you can reduce your carbohydrates and eat perfectly, but you can still have a sugar burning metabolism. And that's because of the influence of stress. So stress causes the rise of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And these hormones, from an evolutionary point of view, their job was to help us fight or flee. Yeah. So when we were exposed to stress, back in the day when we were hunter gatherers, that stress probably would have been something like, I don't know, like a dingo, probably not, but certainly something that would have tried to attack us, or it would be someone from another tribe that was trying to take food, and we would have had to have responded to that either by fighting or fleeing. And to do that, what our body would have done is, in response to the cortisol, is release sugar that's stored in the liver, called glycogen, and that would go into the bloodstream and be like an easy to access fuel source for our muscles, which then needed to help us fight or flee. Okay, so from an evolutionary point of view, this stress response was a very helpful one. But in this day and age, our stressors are very different. So our stressors don't really require us to fight or flee, although some of us probably feel like doing that when we're stressed. Our stressors, like usually it's coming from a screen, like it's coming from the news, or it's coming from reading an email, or it's just coming from people around us. And most of the time we're sitting at that point. And so we're not actually moving, we're not actually using the mobilized sugars. And so because we're not using them, our body has to release insulin to then help normalize our blood sugars again. Okay. So you've got diet that can cause rising blood glucose and therefore rising insulin, or you've got stress, which can cause rising blood glucose and therefore rising insulin. And so, here it's not so much thinking about how you would build your plate. It's thinking about, okay, well, what sort of stresses are you exposing yourself to, and what sort of strategies are you putting in place to help you manage those stresses? Yeah, some of it's a matter of just removing them, but you can't always do that. And so then it's a matter of looking at, well, what do you do in response to them? Do you talk about it? Do you verbalize it? Do you breathe through it? Do you go and do some yoga? Do you make sure you get enough sleep? Or do you drink alcohol, drink coffee to keep you going, stay up so you can get more stuff done, or internalize it so you got emotions building up? There are different strategies that you can put into place, and some of them can be really productive. I love yoga as a strategy for dealing with the physiological stress response, because there's been randomized controlled trials done around the benefits of yoga, showing predominantly that it's the shavasana that happens at the end of class. And if you haven't done yoga, that's like the 3 to 5 minutes where you're lying down, not asleep, but not doing anything. And that has the potential to really benefit cortisol levels. And you can manufacture that yourself. So you can sit and do deep breathing for 3 minutes or 5 minutes in your own time. I often recommend to my clients that they tack it on the end of an already existing habit. So if you go and work out already 4 times a week, why don't you just tack 3 to 5 minutes of deep breathing on the end of that workout, whether it be in the car on the way home before you sort of get back to the real world, or whether it be there after you've done your cool down, you sit down and you do 3 to 5 minutes of deep breathing. I don't know, everybody's going to find a different way of doing it, but when you can put it into place and you can do it consistently, 30 days, the benefits are really noticeable. Because like I said before, you can't necessarily remove all the stresses, but you can change the physiological response. And so if you sort of adapted yourself to being present and being able to breathe deeply in a non-stressful scenario, then you can bring that practice to a stressful scenario and therefore change the hormonal response to the stresses that you might be exposed to. So that's like mindfulness meditation, basically. I like to call it a breathing practice because I think it's far less intimidating for people that have never done meditation before. And you can simply breathe and listen to your breath, or you can download apps. There's one called Insight Timer, which I really love. And they have like a smorgasbord of mindfulness meditation resources that you can tap into. And there's one called Smiling Mind, which I don't know if any of you have heard of, but Smiling Mind is developed specifically for children. So that's a program that I think goes through schools, well, did go through schools. I'm sure it still does. I'm getting a few nods. But Smiling Minds is an awesome one to share with like children if you've got them in the household and you feel like they need some stress and coping mechanisms right now. For some of my clients, getting into that fat burning state can be really challenging. And often it's because there's a combination of things going on, like it's the diet that's contributing to the lack of metabolic efficiency or flexibility, and it's the stresses in the life that are contributing to that inability to burn fat. And so in these cases, I usually always do testing. So blood testing, so we can have a look at some of the key markers to indicate metabolic flexibility or fat burning ability. And the markers that we look at in bloods are glycated hemoglobin, triglyceride levels, fasting blood glucose. They're the three key markers. We want to see glycated hemoglobin at 5.3. Feel free to write these down if you're planning on getting testing done. But we want to see glycated hemoglobin at 5.3. We want to see fasting blood glucose at 5.1 or less, 5.3 or less, 5.1 or less. And we want to see triglyceride levels at around about 1. Anything that's above those is a sign of a metabolism that is geared more towards that sugar burning state. In terms of stress, there's a variety of hormone tests that I do in clinic. They're a bit harder to get through a doctor. You can do morning cortisol through a doctor, but ideally when it comes to testing cortisol, we'd be looking at 4 points of cortisol production over the course of the day, because cortisol isn't like this flat line. It actually peaks at the early part of the day and then it comes down quite significantly by the middle part of the day and really peters off into the evening. So being able to measure those 4 points of the day really helps us to understand whether cortisol is following a regular curve or whether cortisol is following a dysregulated curve. And a dysregulated curve would really indicate that, yep, okay, it's not just diet. In this case, there's a lot of lifestyle and stress factors which are impacting somebody's metabolic health and their ability to utilize fats for fuel. Okay. If anybody's interested in learning more about that testing, because I did just run through that really quickly, then feel free to sort of pose it in the questions after this chat. But I think for the immediate future, while we all need to, get our bearings on what we're eating potentially again, then I think, coming back to that guiding principle of just eating real food, remembering that food has the impact to support the fat burning environment, or it has the ability to take away from the fat burning environment. It has the ability to attenuate inflammation, or it has the ability to promote inflammation. And you are in control of, what you eat and therefore how your food influences your physiology. So yeah, when you're next deciding between the toasted sandwich and the salad or the warm salad or the bowl of soup, I would say I'm going to think about how this meal might influence my physiology and maybe make a choice to have something that will positively influence your physiology and therefore positively influence how you feel in the 4 to 5 hours later, as opposed to just the 4 to 5 minutes after the meal. There's lots of reading on our website, which is thenaturalnutritionist.com.au. I share lots of information, or I try to regularly, on my Instagram profile, which is nutritionally.com. That's like nutrition with Elly, Elly afterwards. So both of those would be resources for you to go to for information and recipes as well. I have got some questions though. Examples of good breakfast that might mix into the plate. Yeah, cool. Good question. So thanks for sharing that, Don. Breakfasts. You're still coming back to this checklist, right? So veggies, proteins, quality fats, carbohydrates according to your goals and training. I put berries in this non-starchy veg category, or other low sugar fruits, so kiwi fruit and papaya, just because they sort of reflect the veggie, like they're high in fiber, high in polyphenols, and pretty low in sugar. So you can also use them at breakfast time. But with that in mind, like, two examples, one would be a smoothie. Some people still love smoothies in winter. I do. But smoothies you can build according to the checklist. So you can get your non-starchy veg and your berries, like, spinach and blueberries. And then you can get your protein elements. So it might be a really good quality protein powder. We use Bear Blends in all of our recipes. So you'll see links to Bear Blends on our website. Then you add your healthy fat elements. So that could be, and I'm just going to throw these options out, but that could be like a tablespoon of chia seeds, a tablespoon of tahini, and a couple of big tablespoons of coconut yogurt or regular yogurt, for example. Then you would add the milk of your choice. It could be dairy milk, it could be a nut milk, blend it up, and then you've got like a low carb smoothie. But that would be something that you would have if you hadn't exercised in the morning, or you'd been for really low intensity workout, like let's say a walk. If you had been for a workout, you would add carbs to that smoothie. So you might add a banana, or like you could add like a half a cup of oats or some quinoa flakes or mango to that smoothie. Okay. Eggs, you could do like a savory breakfast. So you could do like 2 cups of veggies in the pan, 3 eggs scrambled in the pan, and then you would add your quality fats. So like half an avocado and maybe a drizzle of olive oil on top. And the carbs that you could add post-training would be something like 1 to 2 slices of bread, or you could add like a half to 1 cup of leftover sweet potato from dinner the night before. That they would probably be sort of the normal ways of adding carbs to eggs in the morning. Just a couple of examples, but on our website, we've got things like chia puddings, different porridges, so not made with oats, but like LSA porridge, quinoa porridge, chia porridge. And we've got lots of different sort of breakfast hashes. We've got pancake recipes, both savory and sweet. So lots of different things to have a look there on our website. I hope that helps. Sandra, you have asked about dairy. Where does this fit into the equation? How much dairy can we have? So dairy, I like put dairy on its own spectrum. So we can have like higher sugar dairy, like confectionery, like ice cream and flavored yogurts and flavored milks. And then we can have lower sugar dairy. So things like grass-fed butter, a hard cheese, then cheeses, then milks. So this sort of spectrum of dairy with sugar. We really want to stick towards this top end of the spectrum if metabolic efficiency is our goal. So that's like grass-fed butter and hard cheese, maybe some yogurt. But as we get further down that end of the spectrum, the sugar content starts to impact our insulin levels and therefore our fat burning ability. So a lot of our recipes actually don't use a lot of dairy. We definitely use grass-fed butter in there. We draw on like goat's cheese and hard cheddar sometimes, but you'll see that our smoothies, porridges tend to use a milk alternative. Milk alternatives aren't necessarily trying to I guess, replace milk from a nutritional point of view, I should say as well. There's a lot of like, what milk should I have? What nut milk should I have? We can get the nutrients that we would get from milk in other places, or dairy milk, I should say, right? So we can get the calcium from other places. We can get the fats from other places, the protein, the vitamin D. We can get that from other places. So when we're putting milk in our recipes, we're just thinking about what tastes good, what helps to bring the consistency that we're after to that recipe. We're not so much thinking about the quality fats, the protein, the vitamin D, the calcium, because that comes from other places in the diet. So if you want to have dairy, try and keep those lower sugar options in mind, like butter and hard cheese. If it's milk, then try and think about how much of that you're having. And and the lower the better, or the less the better. Prue, you have asked a question about cooking with tofu or tempeh. I love that question because I eat a lot of it, so I'm happy to help out with it. There's definitely good and bad. So you can buy really highly processed, genetically modified tofu and tempeh products. And that would be things that are like packaged in sweet chili sauces and other sauces. Or you can buy what I would sort of think as being the whole alternative. So like a slab of tempeh or a slab of unflavored tofu. So like number one, you're looking for non-genetically modified organic product. And then number two, you're looking for largely unflavored product. So you want to bring the flavor to it yourself in the cooking process. Try and work with tempeh first. I prefer recommending tempeh because it's higher in iron, higher in protein, and less processed than tofu. But tempeh tends to be a bit more of an acquired flavor and texture. So I say start with it because you won't know any different if you start with that. And then maybe you try tofu next. If you go to my personal website, which is nutritionally.com, I have quite a number of tofu and tempeh recipes there, primarily just because that website's dedicated to plant-based recipes. But you can, like, if you don't want to look at new recipes, you know, you could take your current, like, chicken curry or lamb curry recipes, and when you would be browning the meat, for example, you just brown the tempeh. So you add diced tempeh and, you know, brown it with your onions, for example, and then you start adding your flavorings and your creams and your veggies and stuff like that to build your curry in this example. Or like if you're doing a stir fry, like rather than chucking, you know, chicken in the wok and stir frying the chicken, you would add the tempeh or the tofu, brown it, and then add everything else that you need to add. That's where I would start with tofu or tempeh. Buy a firm tofu as well. The silken tofu just won't work if you're doing like if you're trying to just like replace the meat element of your traditional like stir fry or curry. Then you can start to get more, you know, fancy with it, and you can do tempeh omelets, and you can do tempeh frittatas, and you can make little gems and make them beautiful and crispy. But I would start simple, curries and stir fries. Yeah. I'm going to say Casey Powell. I don't know if your name is Casey or if KC stands for something, but hi. You've asked about hydration and how much water should we be having. I love this question because I actually scoot over hydration in most of my presentations, but in most of my consultations, hydration is like, you know, something that we need to address. Dehydration is a big contributor to like brain fog and low energy levels. So it is really important that we hydrate adequately. And I used to work in the corporate health space, and like some offices, there'd be like a diagram on the back of their toilet doors with like a color of urine. If it was like yellow or orange, that was like the indicator that you're dehydrated. If your urine is yellow or orange, you're too far dehydrated. Like you don't want to let it get to that point. It should be clear. So first think of that as a guide, but if you're not really one to look at your urine, then think of 2 liters a day as being your guide, 2 liters or more. So 2 liters is your foundation, and add to that the more you exercise, and add about another 500 mil for every hour that you're exercising. So that might see you on anywhere between like 2 liters and 3 liters or 4 or so liters per day, depending on what sort of exercise you do. But that should be water or herbal teas. Bone broth can contribute to that as well. But the hydration doesn't come from caffeinated beverages. So if you're drinking coffee or like a caffeinated tea, then that water in that beverage doesn't contribute to your hydration goals. Okay. I don't recommend hydrating at meal times. So you can certainly sip at meal times, but I wouldn't recommend that like you sit down and finish your bottle of water alongside your meal, primarily because that does have the potential to dilute our digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid, and therefore take away from your digestive capacity. So what you want to do is really drip feed. So like drip water in throughout the course of the day, and maybe drip a little in over the course of a meal. but you're not using that meal time to hydrate, so to speak. Casey, I hope that helps. I can see a lot of people sort of picking up their bottles as I was talking on that. I do that whenever I talk to a client, I sip water. Sorry, whenever I talk to a client and we're touching on hydration, I sip water. It's just like this reaction of mine. I look for any opportunity that I can. I also like keep tabs of where I'm at during the day. So like I know how many bottles I need to have, and I try and like think about it at certain times of the day, you know, think back as to how many I've had, and therefore I never let myself get too far behind. Claire, thank you for your question. Yep, good, simple question. What is a serve of carbs? So again, this is where nutrition is relative. So it's slightly smaller for females, slightly larger for males. And if, like there would of course be nuances there, but in this sort of setting where I'm not speaking to you all one-on-one, think of a half a cup of carbs as being a female portion. So that would be half a cup of quinoa, rice, potato, sweet potato, pasta if it's pasta. It would be a piece of fruit, so like a banana, a big apple, or it would be like a piece of bread or 2 pieces of small bread or thin slices. And for a male, it would be double. So a cup of rice, a cup of potato, a cup of sweet potato, a cup of pasta. Okay. So depending on what you're used to, that portion could actually be a lot smaller than what you're used to. So it's important that you really get those 2 cups of veggies, that full portion of protein and those fats in at meal times, because we're not trying to leave you hungry. We're just trying to change where your nutrients come from at mealtime. I can't see any more questions, but I'm totally open to answering any more. If anyone's got anything they want to add. Anything that anyone's been asking you, Mark?
Look, I'm just going to add my spotlight for a sec. No, not in particular. Everything we went through, I think, is fantastic. Apologies, everyone. I do have a sore throat at the moment. I love the questions at the end. They were really good. My main thing is, I think, talking quite specific about little habits, and that is exactly what everyone is looking for at the moment as a means of what we can implement maybe the next week, but then ongoing as well. So those little questions, you know, I love the actual bringing together the idea of obviously how different foods that our eating can influence our blood sugar levels, but then how also stress can as well, because that's quite appropriate at the moment too. So we always talk about balance with our training group. So having both that nutrition but the lifestyle side as well connected, I think is a really interesting topic. If there's anyone else that would like to unmute themselves or put a quick question in the chat, you're more than welcome to.
I've just answered a few questions in the chat, but Sandra's asked another question. Not another question, just a question around about oats here in Australia. So oats in Australia, like unless they're certified gluten-free oats, they would likely be contaminated just due to like the processing facilities that they're processed in. So there may be traces of gluten in there. There are some sort of international or imported oats that are certified gluten-free, and so you could use those for sure. It just depends on your level of reactivity. So for some people, if like gluten's not something that triggers immediate reactivity, or if you're not sort of clawing your way back from diagnosed increased intestinal permeability, or if you haven't got an autoimmune condition, then I would say, you know, include the Aussie oats. But if you do fall into any of those previous categories that I just mentioned, then I would say try and steer clear of the oats and use other whole food carbohydrates like quinoa flakes or potato or sweet potato. I know they're not a direct replacement, but try and focus on other whole food carbohydrates. Yeah. Any other questions?
Perfect. Last chance, everyone. You got Elly here to ask any questions you'd like quickly.
Jo's looking at our recipe. She's already hungry. That's good to know.
Yeah. As Elly mentioned, there is some really amazing literature on the Natural Nutritionist website, and then also Nutrition Elly as well. So if something pops up afterwards, you're obviously more than welcome to ask me at training, and we'll refer you to different spots. But they are two great resources for you to be able to utilize as well. All right. I think a few people just saying thank you. Great. So Elly, on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you for giving us your time tonight. The idea was hopefully, everyone can come away with some, some practical things you can implement into your own lifestyle. As I said, whether it be this week or particularly ongoing. And I've written a whole page of stuff, and this is the second time I've heard you talk on this topic, and I've written a whole lot of new stuff as well. So I'm hoping that everyone's been able to just write a couple of things that you'll be able to implement yourself as well.
I'll just say thanks for bringing us all together, Mark. And yeah, everybody take care of yourselves over the next couple of weeks, and remain patient to those people around you as well.
Yeah, perfect. All right, everyone else, thank you very much for jumping on board. As I said, lucky I wasn't talking tonight in my throat, but I appreciate you taking time off in the evening, and we'll hopefully see you at training during this week, or when we can get back to things properly, fingers crossed, from next week as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mark. Get well soon.
Thanks both. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks.
No probs. Thank you, everyone.